Today's guest is a woman whose journey is equal parts inspiring and empowering. Tina Montoya has been practicing law in Texas for more than 2 decades. She's not just an experienced attorney, she's also an author, a fierce advocate, and somebody who has taken the pain and challenges of life and turned them into a powerful platform for healing and growth. Tina recently released her book, Great Things, and it's exactly that, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In it, she opens up about her personal experiences, both as a woman who's walked through adversity and as a lawyer who's helped countless clients navigate incredibly difficult circumstances, including domestic and emotional abuse. She's here today to talk about some of those lessons, offer guidance for anybody going through divorce or legal hardship, and to remind us all that no matter where you start or what you've been through, great things are always possible. Today's podcast is sponsored by MD Hearing. MD Hearing is founded by an ENT surgeon who saw how many of his patients needed hearing aids but just couldn't afford them. He made it his mission to develop a high-quality hearing aid that anybody could afford. Get the high-quality, affordable hearing aids you deserve with MD Hearing. Go to shopmdhearing.com and use promo code OVER50 to get a pair of hearing aids for just $297. Plus, they are adding a free extra charging case, a $100 value just for listeners of Over 50 and Flourishing. That's shopmdhearing.com. Use our promo code OVER50 and get a pair of hearing aids for just $297. This podcast is sponsored by Naked Wines. NakedWines.com, a great place to shop for wine and get it shipped to you. You get 6 bottles. You get to fill out a little survey of the type of wine you like. I'm a Pinot kind of gal, Pinot Grigio, Pinot Noir. I absolutely loved my selection from Naked Wines. It was so easy. Just fill it out. It gets shipped to the door. I don't have to worry about it anymore, and I'm not spending crazy money either. But now is the time to join the Naked Wines community. Just head to nakedwines.com/over50, click enter voucher, and put in my code over50 for both the code and password for 6 bottles of wine for just $39.99, shipping included. That is $100 off your first 6 bottles at nakedwines.com/over50 and use the code and password over50 for 6 bottles of wine for $39.99. Gals, it's time to get our guts in order. And if I told you you could have a healthy gut microbiome with a top quality product at 25% off, would that pique your interest? I sure hope so, because I love telling you about Ritual. If you're looking for digestive support, Ritual has you. I take their Symbiotic Plus. It's a 3-in-1 supplement of clinically studied pre, pro, and postbiotics, which support a balanced gut microbiome with daily use. So get your gut going. Support a balanced gut microbiome with Ritual's Symbiotic Plus. Get 25% off your first month at ritual.com/over50. That's ritual.com/over50 for 25% off your first month. Tina, it is really great to have you today for a number of reasons. First of all, your story and your journey is incredibly powerful. I think there are so many women who will find themselves in the words that you've written in your book, which we're going to talk about a great deal. You do have a new book out, and it's called You're Going to Do Great Things Someday. And I know who spoke those words over you. Which we'll dive into as well. But you're also a practicing attorney. And as I read your story, it became so evident to me as to why you specialized in the type of law that you do. So first of all, welcome to Over 50 and Flourishing. My goodness, my dear, you are flourishing. You are amazing.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I feel so blessed.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. And, people always say, and you even said this in your book, people said to you, you should write a book. You should write a book. I mean, if you would count how many times that sentence has been uttered, and yet very few people put pen to paper or fingers to keypad. You did to document essentially your history. But what prompted you to pursue putting all of this into a book? And tell us about your story.
It was God. I mean, he really just kind of pressed on my heart Initially in 2009 when I started, I did pen to, I was a lawyer, right? I just wrote
Hmm.
down the facts and,
Sure.
got the facts down. I was like, okay, I'm done, and then in 2015, he prompted me to pick it up again and did some more, a couple of years. And then in 2022, I was laying on the couch feeling sorry for myself. I'd had some health issues and I was watching Viola Davis's
Mm.
interview with Oprah. And at the end of that interview, I literally got up off the couch and went to my computer and said, it's time to do this.
Mhm. Yeah, it's funny how certain things in life can trigger us to move and act on what's been planted and what has been stirring. As I read your book, you're from the Dallas area. You're actually here. You're a practicing attorney in the Dallas area. Your childhood was anything but storied. Walk us through. I know we can't spend the entire podcast, although I think we could, and in some cases should, just on your journey. But give us sort of that Reader's Digest version of what childhood was like for you and what you went through.
My first memories are great. We had kind of like a picture perfect to the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 70s, early 80s, it's just, everybody minded their own business. You kept your problems inside, right? I was going to private school, I was super smart, but I started acting out, of course. And then, in between some of that picture perfect, there was some domestic violence happening. But, I kind of thought it was normal,
Mm.
just seeing that fighting and the yelling and then they got a divorce. And that was pretty traumatic. And, it also kind of helps me with my clients today. Having been a child going through divorce, I use that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And after the divorce, you've read the book, I ended up with my father. And then shortly thereafter, my mother passed. And that's the journey of, maybe call it couch surfing, from
Mm-hmm.
like age 11, 12. And, I struggled a lot. My mother put faith in me. She always talked about God and always prayed. And she always talked about him like he was like right here,
Mm-hmm.
and that was confusing to me. And she did it to me, as a young child. And I remember, thinking like, God, where are you? And so, there were several years during, probably 12 to 18 where I was just like, I don't know where you are and why you've deserted me. My mother told me all these great things about you. And
Yeah.
that's kind of a Reader's Digest.
Yeah, there's a lot more to unpack there. You lost your mother in a very tragic way. It was ruled a suicide. You feel otherwise, and in fact, at the back of the book, you've uncovered some police records, and I feel like you're doing your own sleuthing. You have your feelings as to what happened there. For you, it was more than divorce. It was an alcoholic dad. It was abuse. I mean, it was rough at many points. So talk about just losing your mother the way that you did, and what happened there.
It was just kind of a shock,
Mm-hmm.
you know. In an odd way, I'd like to say my dad prepared me for it. Because once I ended up in his custody, like I didn't speak to her or talk to her very much. And then there were a few times that I did, and then I would just cry thinking, when am I going to see you again? And just, the sobbing of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so then there was this period of time where, nobody ever talked about her. It was like she didn't exist, and at the time I was 11. No, I was 10. And so, not talking about her, I don't want to say I forgot about her, but it was kind of easier not to think about her. I don't know if, as a 10-year-old, I chose not to think about her because it was, sorry, I might tear up about this, maybe I chose not to think about her because it was
Mm-hmm.
so tough that I missed her. And then when I found out she was gone, just everything happened so fast. And then nobody talked about her again.
Mm-hmm.
It's like everybody's just moving on. like it never happened. And so in an odd way, my father kind of pre-prepared me by like separating me from her all those months before.
Yeah. You eventually left. I mean, you mentioned couch surfing, and first of all, I'm so sorry for your loss, by the way, and
Thank
you
you.
know how you lost your mother and the impact that that had on your life. Um, you your father being around him, as you wrote about, wasn't a healthy environment whatsoever, and you wound up couch surfing at a very young age in your life. But I was also witnessing, as I read your story, this amazing determination and grit and tenacity that you had, fueled by this faith that it sounds like in a way you didn't understand. So tell us a little bit about that journey.
Man, that it's really difficult to explain.
Mm.
I mean, even today, I went to church at Watermark back in 2010, I think is when I joined. And, they sat down, they're like, tell us your, salvation story.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I said, well, there's like no real definite I can tell you. I said, it just always felt like Jesus was with me. God was with me like all the time. Like I feel like I could just always feel him there, which really confused me because why are all these bad things happening? In my mind, right? These are bad things. And, it's the grace of God. Like, I just can't even explain it, how I just kept going. I mean, is it genetics? Both my parents, I mean, my father had a ton of faults, as you know, but he was a strong man. He had a tough childhood as well. Right. And then my mother did too. And so, I'm a little fiery and strong. I tell people I come by it honest when they meet me, but, I don't even know. It's hard to explain.
Yeah. It was interesting to witness. You were in a certain school and you got into trouble. You were dabbling in things that young people can sometimes dabble in when they are in the throes of pain and trauma, as you were. You were wise enough to recognize it and to recognize that you weren't even in the right school for you. And you marched to a different school on a different side of town, and you basically said, I need to be here. Walk us through that journey. That was an interesting read.
The high school that I was attending, I'd gotten into so much trouble. Like every teacher in that high school knew me, even though I wasn't in
Mm-hmm.
their class. And, I could just be standing around trouble. And next thing you know, I'm in the office. So I really, I couldn't get what I thought was a fresh start, and I really wanted to change, the course of my life. I always knew I wanted to do something different. But frankly, I was on my own, making my own rules, and so I was pushing the limits. Right. And I just kept pushing and pushing, and I pushed a little too far. And then when I made that decision to, change the course of my life, I couldn't do it at that high school. And I knew that I had to change to get a fresh start. And so I came up with this idea, and I'm just going to have to tell you, it had to be God. I was 15, 16 years old. How would I be like, maybe if I, go to a new school, I could have a better chance. I mean, I just woke up one day with that idea, and I kind of just marched forward and went in there and asked for permission. And you read how that went. It was a little
Yeah, well, it's
tough.
interesting because the woman who greeted you, was she the registrar, or she was like the assistant to the principal, or I mean, it was somebody where you had an opportunity to basically blurt out your story within a
Yeah.
matter of minutes, right? You just
Yes.
let
Yes.
it flow.
I
But then
really
when you
did.
sat there and you told the same story to the principal, you were met with a very different response.
I was, and I told it a little bit differently too. I don't know if you recognize that because,
Mm-hmm.
when I was working with my editor, she was like, why was his response so, not welcoming? And I had to really think back, and I was so nervous that, I told it in a different way, and I was like really short, in what I told. And so he didn't get all the details. I think
Mm-hmm.
that the lady got, and the attendance lady, that's what she did. Like
Yeah.
she sat there and, greeted kids in the morning, and maybe because he was a male, right? I was like so nervous, just looking back on that moment, I think to myself, why didn't I just tell him everything, because I didn't. But yeah, I mean, he was pretty stern.
Yeah. Well, you were very, very fortunate because as you walked out of that office with tears in your eyes, the attendance lady saw it, said what happened. You told her, she marched in, talked to him, and then convinced him that you should come
Yes.
over to this new high school, presuming that your attendance is perfect. So, it's I agree. God put you there, and also He put her there, and she basically took you in under her wing. And I think that was the start of just a new life, new way, and new opportunity for you. And I think it's really important to talk about these things and to honor that calling and that voice. Because some doors really, really open for you. And we're going to get into how you made it into law school. And then, oh my gosh, how you even passed the bar is the wildest story in and of itself. And I also want to spend some time allowing you to help women who are coming to this podcast. A, your story is amazing, and I think everybody should hear it. But B, there are a lot of women in situations where they might be contemplating what you do and your services. And even just the thought is daunting, overwhelming, frightening, and perplexing. So we have a lot to unpack here today. But my guest is Tina Montoya, the author of You're Going to Do Great Things Someday. And we'll be back to further the conversation right after this. Ladies, sometimes we know that our guys have, quote, selective hearing, but if you're dealing with any form of hearing loss, don't let the cost or the bulkiness steer you away. Today's podcast is sponsored by MD Hearing. And if I told you you could get high quality hearing aids that are invisible for under $300, would you listen? MD Hearing is founded by an ENT surgeon who saw how many of his patients needed hearing aids but just couldn't afford them. He made it his mission to develop a high quality hearing aid that anybody could afford. Plus, MD Hearing has sold over 2 million hearing aids, and they offer a 45-day risk-free trial with a 100% money-back guarantee, so you can buy with confidence. I even turned one of my dear friends onto them, and he has been thrilled. Get the high-quality, affordable hearing aids you deserve with MD Hearing. Go to shopmdhearing.com and use promo code OVER50 to get a pair of hearing aids for just $297. Plus, they are adding a free extra charging case, a $100 value just for listeners of Over 50 and Flourishing. That's shopmdhearing.com. Use our promo code OVER50 and get a pair of hearing aids for just $297. This podcast is sponsored by Naked Wines. It's 2025. Are you still shopping for wine like it is 2025? Come on, it's time to get online and stop weaving and winding through the wine rows and trying to figure out what's the best one. If you're like me, I'm thinking, okay, if you're more expensive, you have to taste better, right? Wrong. Let's talk about Naked Wines. Nakedwines.com, a great place to shop for wine and get it shipped to you. You get 6 bottles. You get to fill out a little survey of the type of wine you like. I'm a Pinot kind of gal, Pinot Grigio, Pinot Noir. I absolutely loved my selection from Naked Wines. It was so easy. Just fill it out. It gets shipped to the door. I don't have to worry about it anymore. And I'm not spending crazy money either. Did you know Naked Wines has been around for more than 15 years and it funds over 90 independent winemakers around the world? That's pretty cool. No commitments, no membership fees. You can enjoy Naked Wines hassle-free, and you can cancel at any time. But now is the time to join the Naked Wines community. Just head to nakedwines.com/over50, click enter voucher, and put in my code over50 for both the code and password for 6 bottles of wine for just $39.99, shipping included. That is $100 off your first 6 bottles at nakedwines.com/over50 and use the code and password over50 for 6 bottles of wine for $39.99. Welcome back. Our guest today is attorney Tina Montoya, who is a divorce attorney specializing in custody, also the author of a new book that we've been talking about. You're going to do great things someday. Tina, that was something your mother said to you, wasn't it?
It really was, yes.
Yeah, she was a believer, and you definitely are. where we left off was you getting into a high school where you really weren't supposed to be, but you made magic happen that day. And that really paved the way for some incredible opportunity for you and a chance to kind of right the ship and, correct maybe some errors in your ways in the past and judgment errors. But the seed was planted also for you to want to become an attorney. Now, mind you, you're fine. I mean, you were literally couch surfing. You were living with a myriad of people at the time. How was all of this coming to be with, I want to be an attorney and how am I going to get to law school?
So the attorney, like it was always in the back of my head. I wanted to be an attorney, but for years I told myself like, that's just not in my cards, So even through probably high school, I think I discounted that would ever be a possibility. Like, how would I ever pay for something like that? I didn't know student loans existed. Nobody told me, student loans existed. And so I think I wanted to do the next best thing, which was I wanted to be a police officer, a detective, because I still, had these questions about my mother and, how those things happened and just wanting justice for other people. And, it wasn't until, I married and I got my degree and I became a legal assistant for an attorney. And, he must have said 50 times, oh, I wish you were an attorney. Oh, I wish you were an attorney. And then a young associate came by my office one day and kind of pressured me. And that's kind of how it got started.
And tell everybody where you wound up going to law school and what that process was like.
I went to Creighton University in Nebraska, and it was so surreal. I was happy to be there, but nervous. I really had difficulty reading, and I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make it. Oddly enough, I found myself a few months before attending law school thinking to myself, you're going to have to read a whole lot. One of the lawyers reminded me that I worked with, and I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I haven't read a book since high school.
Right.
And so, but I'm forging ahead because it's just kind of what I do, and I struggled. I really, really struggled a lot. I went to law school with my ex-husband. He went as well. And the way I gauged how much I studied was I did twice as much as he did. He could read something once and, he got it down. But Creighton was more like a family. Like they were tough, and they really prepared me well to come out and practice law. And I'm just so thankful for them.
How did you afford it? You mentioned the financial aspect earlier.
So they gave me a 50% scholarship and then student loans. I came out with about $75,000.
Yeah, in debt. But you made it through, but barely, because we've got to talk about how you passed the bar, because wow. So there was something happening at the time with the grading system. It was a fluke. It was a one-off, and it was nationwide, right?
Yes, that is correct.
So you had taken the bar and you were waiting for the results, which, by the way, were slated to come down on your mother's birthday, right?
That is correct.
Okay, so tell everybody what happened.
So that was my second time to take the bar. I'd failed the first time. And the results were supposed to come out on her birthday. And I thought to myself, this has got to be it. Like, this is why I failed the first time, so it would be memorable. I was actually, unfortunately going through a separation and a divorce. And so my focus wasn't really there, and it was even less focused than it had been the first time. But, I kind of challenged God, a week before I took the test. And I literally threw my books at the wall and said, if you want me to be a lawyer, you better make it happen. I have that relationship with God. Some of my friends, that's a little controversial, but, he knows my heart, and I don't feel like there's any reason to hide my true feelings. And so I took the test, just not even, thinking I would pass. But then I had this small hope because it was her birthday. And then I got the results. and I failed by 7 points.
Mm-hmm.
And
so now you're working and you're thinking, great, I can't even continue to work here. So what happens now at your firm?
so I go in and I go talk to my boss and I said, listen, I'm sorry I let you down, but I failed again. I would fire me too. Like, you don't even have to say it, you know. But I said, I'll stay a couple of weeks, to help, finish up my projects and make sure that, you're on track to not, miss any deadlines, things of that nature. And he's like, yeah, that would be good, And so I did. So I was working my 2 weeks out, and a friend of mine from California called me to tell me there was a big problem. I don't want to use the word she said because the words she said were a little explicit, but
Right.
So she started telling me about this grading problem. So all the states in the all the states take the same multiple choice test. It's called the MBE.
Okay.
And she said that they had hired a new place to do the grading and that they had messed up one question. And so they were having to figure out what to do. And, I said, oh, I love you, but one question on a 200 multiple choice is not going to change my 7 points.
Right. And
so, but that weekend, I just kind of kept feeling I needed to call the state bar and figure out, like, I had this turmoil of a weekend. Like, I'd have hope and then I wouldn't. And then I called, and I had a guy there that I had been talking with, who helped me through some other things I was going through while taking the bar. And he's like, Tina, I promise I'll call you later this afternoon. He's like, we just found out and things are crazy. And lo and behold, I got a call at 1:00 that afternoon and I passed.
And you were one of how many?
5.
Yeah. 1 of 5.
So it turns out one of the questions that they misgraded was kind of like a test question. They always put in some test questions, and they're super difficult. And like they're intended to be difficult. It's kind of what I do, though. I do really well on difficult things. And some of the easiest things I don't get right. So it was kind of comical that I did get that one multiple choice question correct. And then when they graded my essays, I got a few extra points because, essays, it's subjective.
It's subjective, right.
Right.
So that one question plus the extra points from the essays got you to the 7 that you needed to pass.
Yeah.
Yeah. If that's not a miracle, I don't know what was.
A friend of mine said, God literally moved mountains.
Yeah.
For you to pass. But I believe that he knew I needed that process because practicing law has been so difficult. And in moments where I wasn't sure if I could keep going, I knew that this was my calling. Mm-hmm. And I knew that because he's the one that made me pass.
Right.
So,
right. And he got you there.
He
so how long have you been practicing now?
A little over 20 years. So 2003, 23 years.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about the focus and the evolution of your practice and what you're doing.
I started off doing bankruptcy law, and I just kind of naturally evolved into family law. I was working in a small town outside of Dallas, and, people just kind of start walking in, to the office needing help. And then there was a more seasoned lawyer down the street, and he had heard that I had come to town, because little towns are, a little protective of their people. And he came by one day and he said, oh, I heard you were here. Where'd you come from? And then he left. Well, then he and I ended up having a case against each other a couple of weeks later. I don't know what he was. He was 25, 30-year lawyer. And at that point, I'd never even tried a case.
Yeah.
So I went against him. I mean, I fought as hard as I could. I didn't win. And then he came back. And he said, I have extra cases a lot. They can't afford me. Would you like me to send you some cases? And all he did was family law and custody. That was his expertise. He was just known, in the town to be the best of the best. Still is. And so he started giving me all the cases that couldn't afford him. And so I just kind of naturally moved into that practice.
Yeah. Could you see yourself in a lot of these cases?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I'll tell you, the first 3 to 5 years, maybe, I teared up with a lot of my clients. I could just really feel for them, as I still do, but not as much as I used to. But I found that the clients really liked that. I kind of would feel a little embarrassed at first, because I'm thinking, oh, I'm a professional, I should be. But, they were like, wow, you really understand.
Yeah, you could empathize.
And then I could really give them advice on, what it was like to be a child going through divorce, and then what it was like to go through my own divorce. And I feel like I just had more practical knowledge to give them other than just legal knowledge. And over the years, I kind of found myself feeling really obligated to nurture my clients on an emotional side as well, not just legal, because after you come out of a divorce, like, your life is changed and it can be disastrous for some people.
Yeah.
So I always try to prepare my clients for that. I don't just focus on the legal. I say, okay, now what's your plan after this? They're like, oh, I don't, I was like, we got to talk about that. And so, yeah, it just kind of evolved.
Right. I think that's the blessing in that your background serves you in this way to better prepare and enrich your clients through what I will arguably say is one of the toughest things that you will go through in life. In every way, you will experience every emotion there is to experience, and things will happen that you never, ever could have imagined or conjured. I don't know. It's like being in the spin cycle of a dryer. So, walk people through that. There may be people who are watching and listening right now who could be in really, really dire straits in their marriages and their relationships. Obviously we'll encourage everybody should seek therapy first and try your best if anything is salvageable. But just talk to us about the family law. Actually, we're gonna hold that and just thank our sponsors, because I know the answer to this question is going to be long, complex, and is going to take some time to process. And I want to give people that respect and that time. So let's thank our sponsors, and we'll be right back to talk more about family law and what you can expect in that process. Gals, it's time to get our guts in order. And if I told you you could have a healthy gut microbiome with a top quality product at 25% off, would that pique your interest? I sure hope so, because I love telling you about Ritual. If you're looking for digestive support, Ritual has you. I take their Symbiotic Plus. It's a 3-in-1 supplement of clinically studied pre, pro, and postbiotics, which support a balanced gut microbiome with daily use. So easy, once a day, taken with food, without food. It has a minty essence, so it goes down super, super easy. But Symbiotic Plus is designed with a delayed release capsule. Here's why that's important. It helps to reach the colon, not the stomach. You see, the colon is the ideal place for probiotics to survive and grow. It's vegan friendly, formulated without GMOs, major allergens, animal products, shady fillers, artificial colors. You can trust it. So get your gut going. Support a balanced gut microbiome with Ritual's Symbiotic Plus. Get 25% off your first month at ritual.com/over50. That's ritual.com/over50 for 25% off your first month. Over 50 and Flourishing listeners, you guys are do-it-yourself, take charge kind of women. So why not take control of our pest control? I mean, think about it. We always outsource, and we can spend over $800 a year just trying to remedy the pests. But with Pesty, you can get started for just $35 per treatment with a customized plan based on your location, the kind of bugs that you have, and climate. Boy, doesn't it feel good knowing that your house is going to be bug-free for another season? And it's so easy to do. Less than 10 minutes, you get a starter kit that includes a sprayer, mixing bag, pesticide, gloves, and instructions. The kit includes a reusable electronic sprayer and all of the things that I just mentioned. You get it done in less than 10 minutes, and it gets rid of over 100 types of bugs. It's also kid and pet friendly, and I know that's important to you. So now is the time to protect your home from bugs with Pesty. Go to pesty.com/over50 for an extra 10% off your order. That's pestie.com/over50 for an extra 10% off. Welcome back. We are having a heart-to-heart with Tina Montoya, who is a family law attorney, written a book called You're Gonna Do Great Things Someday, which is really a chronicle of her childhood and what led her to being the woman that she is today, a woman of great faith, great strength, and really, really great moral conviction. So thank you, Tina, for what you do. You serve people in a time in what I would say is one of the hardest times in their lives, when they're either forced, not by choice, or choose to dissolve a marriage. And there is so much to unpack with that. Family, children, you name it. So we were getting into that. We were starting to touch on the process of what that looks like. And I want to ask you to basically look into the camera, speak from your heart, and just tell a woman who's listening right now, if she's anywhere near that process, what does she need to consider right now?
That is a big question.
Yeah.
I always encourage therapy. I believe in marriage. I believe that when we divorce, sometimes we find the same spouse later. So if you can work on your marriage now and fix whatever, the issues you have, that's always number one, but you can't be the only one. It takes two people, right? So if your spouse isn't willing, then, divorce is the option, maybe the only option. Sometimes I think timing is very important because, you may feel like, okay, I got to get out right now. And sometimes, domestic violence or emotional abuse, you do need to get out right now. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes, Texas doesn't, and I know your listeners are from everywhere, but, Texas isn't very favorable to spousal support. Mm-hmm. And so some women that have raised kids their whole life and don't have a career, they come to me and they're shocked about, what do I get? And it's just not much. So sometimes I have talked to women and thought, now might not be the time. You might need to plan. You might think about trying to get a career, going back to school. Is it, tolerable? So maybe you want to work on the marriage, and maybe you want to work on yourself to figure out what are you going to do after the divorce? Mm-hmm. And so I think timing is important, and I do think most lawyers, when you talk to them, they're like, yeah, you're ready to go. And so, you might not get that from some lawyers, and not because they're not good lawyers, just because they don't think about that. I think just, again, because of my childhood, those things kind of run through my mind of a long-term plan. And so that's one thing. The other
Let's
thing
also talk about the cost. That's something else to be considered.
Well, and that's another timing issue, mm-hmm. right? Because sometimes you might have to borrow from family members, or again, might need to get a job before you leave and start saving money. Or some of my clients get an allowance, stop spending your allowance, start saving your allowance, which is awful, that they get an allowance. Yeah. But yes, I mean, a divorce cost a minimum of about $5,000 to $10,000. And that's minimum. And that's if it's minimum. And that's if it's, mostly agreed. Mm-hmm. And, I'm probably not charging enough. So if you had another lawyer on here, they might say a different number. But yes, it's so costly. So the more you can plan ahead, I think the better off you are. So I think that would be my number one suggestion, is to talk to more than one lawyer. Mm-hmm. Because I would tell people, you need to like your lawyer and trust your lawyer.
Right.
And because your lawyer is going to deliver a lot of bad news that you don't like. And I tell my clients, you at least need to like the person delivering the news, right? And you need to trust them. If you doubt anything that your lawyer's saying, you just need to get a new lawyer immediately, because it's not going to serve you well. You're paying all this money and then you're second guessing, you're Googling, oh, my friend told me this. And, your friends aren't always telling the truth about what happened, or they don't understand, And so I think planning, that might be my number one suggestion.
And what types of things should people plan for? I mean, clearly we're talking in a financial realm here. What else?
Sure. Again, figuring out, if you're a stay-at-home mom, what kind of career are you going to get? You've got to figure out how you're going to support yourself. And if you have children, how that's going to, affect your children, the finances. Child support's not a lot, depending on how many children you have. A lot of husbands lose their job. They were once making 200 grand and, no more getting bonuses now, and just, things like that. I think finding a counselor, someone to talk to before making that decision, is really important, because it's hard to make decisions, such important decisions, when your mind isn't clear.
Correct.
And when you're going through a divorce, your mind is not clear. When I went through my divorce, and by the way, if you're going through a divorce and you've done some things that, oh my gosh, I would have never done that. We all have. It's kind of part of going through a divorce, but you definitely, and sometimes I think antidepressants. I tell almost every single, I'm an antidepressant cheerleader. I believe in it. I think it can help you get through such a tough situation. It's not for everybody, and some of my clients don't do it. Most of them do. And I can really see a difference in their clear-headedness and being able to make decisions. So I think speaking with a counselor, even for yourself, like not just marriage, counseling,
Sure.
If that's not working, talk to a counselor how to start processing these feelings, because you're going to have to go through all the stages of grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Support is so important, whether through church, pastor, counselor, you name it. And I think too, sometimes you have to be weary of family and friends, because they can want to steer and they don't necessarily know the inner workings, the true inner workings of the marriage, the nuances. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. In fact, I struggle with dealing with family. Mm-hmm. And I am I don't know any other attorney that does this, but I will not allow family members to come to appointments, to sit in on the appointments. I say not allowed to come. They can come, and they can come in for the first 10 minutes, and they can tell me, I'll say, so what is it, mom or dad, that you can tell me that your daughter or son can't tell me? So that's what I want to hear, and I'm ready to write it down. And then I'll say, okay, I said, well, everything else now needs to be between me and your daughter or son, and it's attorney-client privilege, so I'm going to need you to step outside. And a lot of times I get pushback. Sometimes they're like, oh, well, I'm not going to hire you. And I said, listen, I feel so strongly about this that I'm okay with that. Like, a lot of times I really push hard with my younger clients, the 20s, the 25, they've had a child with, a boyfriend or something. And it's just a great time for them to learn how to make decisions, hard decisions on their own, And I tell them also too, it's a way for me to make sure that they understand what I'm telling them. So I say, I'll tell your daughter or son, what I suggest, what the plan is, and then she or he goes home and tells you. And if she can't, or he can't tell you, then she doesn't understand it, and she can call back, or he can call back, and we'll go through it again. So it really helps me help them, grow up, learn how to make, difficult decisions. And I will tell you, 90% of the time when I make the parents or aunt or uncle leave the room, I'll ask them, I'll say, listen, did you really, really want them in here? Because I can let them in if I want to. And they almost always say no.
Yeah.
But they can't say that in front of whoever's paying the
family
bill.
member.
Right? Sometimes they're paying the bill and they're like, well, I want to,
right.
be here. So.
Right. Well, wise on your part, very wise. So much to consider too. There's child support, there's alimony, custody. So walk us through that. And I think, so many people often think, well, the man's going to support the woman. Well, that's not always the case. And it will vary state by state, won't it? And it will certainly vary according to who's bringing in the income.
That is absolutely true. Like I said before, Texas is not favorable to spousal support. And typically when you file for a divorce, if you have children, you'll have to go to what's called a temporary hearing. Because as soon as you file a divorce, you need a court order that says, okay, who's going to have the children this day, and who's going to drive which car, who's going to live in the house, who's going to pay the bills. So you're pretty quickly into court. And during that time, my clients, the female mostly, think, okay, well, during the divorce, which can last a year, 2 years, they're like, I'll get spousal support, right? And it depends on your judge mostly. But in the counties I practice in, the wife or husband who's asking for spousal support is lucky to get 3 months of spousal support. And that's why planning is so important, because you need to know that you're going to be out on your own like that. And that can be a real shock to people.
Yeah. Talk about alimony. That I know in the state of Texas kicks in after 10 years.
Yes.
What does that mean in a divorce?
Not much. It means if you're married for 10 years in Texas, you're eligible for divorce. For spousal support. But there's a long list of things you have to be able to prove. And one of the things that's the biggest hurdle is that the wife or whoever's asking for spousal support has to prove that they cannot meet their minimum needs. Minimum needs is subjective to the person, to the judge, whoever's on the bench. And I will tell you that the judges, that I'm in front of, $25,000 a year, $30,000 a year, that's minimum needs. And even though you were in a marriage with, a husband who made, $500,000 a year, this is now your new life. You're going to be making $30,000 a year, and you're not going to get any spousal support.
And there's so many other things at play. And to your point, this is why having a plan in a case like this is so important. Having support. There are a lot of people who stay in certain situations because they simply can't figure out a way. Which, again, to your point, if you can make it work, if you can come to some kind of a marital agreement where we're going to work on this and resolve this, my gosh, that's the ideal, the ultimate. But so often I hear stories of women who just feel stuck and they don't know what to do. And all of these scenarios that you're talking about do play out. There are other things too that might surprise a lot of people that get factored into a divorce. Previous ownership of things or retirement, pensions, 401ks, talk about that kind of ancillary stuff that's sort of on the outside, but really gets factored and weighed in when you're kind of divvying things up.
Yes. So Texas is a community property state. So anything that you owned prior to marriage is considered your separate property. And anything that you buy or earn during marriage is considered community property. And, you walk into the courthouse with a presumption of you're going to get 50%. That's, across the board, how, they'll usually divvy up the community property. But, if a husband comes into, the marriage with, inheritance, or during the marriage, a wife or husband inherits, that's separate property. Now, the 50% can also be offset a little bit by, the separate property. Say, for instance, if, the husband did come into inheritance of $2 or $3, million, and the community estate is $500,000. The judge does have the ability to say, look, you have enough separate property that I'm just going to give her the whole, $500,000. But I'll tell you, it rarely happens. I mean, it's just almost, at least my experience, it's just, almost always 50-50. Right. Now, part of that, though, is very few cases actually go to trial. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, most get settled.
They do. We are mandated to go to mediation. Mm-hmm. And so at mediation, the clients are told, listen, this is what the judge is most likely going to do. And I do that too. I tell the client, and, I tell them, like, is it worth paying me, to maybe get something more? Mm. And so, a lot of times clients feel stuck, like they have to settle. And I hate that for them, but it's just kind of the reality, why at the very beginning, when I have a client, I'm like, okay, let's talk about your long-term plan. And they're like, I want to talk about divorce. And I was like, yes, but what is your long-term plan after divorce?
Right.
Because we might need to make a different plan. I made a plan. Do you mind if I tell a story?
No, go right ahead.
A lady came in a few years ago, and she had a heart attack. And all of a sudden was like, I need a divorce. I hate my life. And of course, you're not supposed to make decisions, right after something so tragic. But after we went through, what she might get in the divorce, she was devastated. I mean, it wasn't going to be much. And I said, is there any way that you guys can either work on the marriage or come to a solution that you can both live with? He had the best way to put it is a persona that he was trying to upkeep. Mm-hmm. And she didn't want to do it, right? So that was part of their rub, right? She's like, I'm not doing these functions with you anymore. And I said, you have a rent house. What if you rented what if you lived in the rent house? What if you agreed to attend so many functions? And if you can't work out the marriage, maybe you can work that out. Mm. And I never heard from her again. So either she worked out the deal or she worked on the marriage. Well, and so it's not the ideal situation, but it's a solution.
Correct. Correct.
That could evolve.
Throwing some of those things out there among the many things that has to be considered. I do want to touch upon a couple of other things. We were talking a little bit about property, and, in the state of Texas, if the two of you are on the note for a house, but the two of you aren't on the deed of the house, then it isn't your house.
No, that's not necessarily true. It depends. I'm wondering if that happened to you, but it depends on how it was purchased originally, with what money it was purchased with. So that can be confusing. If one spouse came in with, $100,000 and they put down money, on that house, even though it's in, their name. So that 100,000 is automatically theirs no matter what. That never changed. Now, if there was a note, like a mortgage note on that, of refinance, we'll say, that happens quite a bit. Yep. And you guys paid down the mortgage, well, then the wife is entitled to, 50% back of what was paid down if it's considered separate property. Mm-hmm. So there is some confusion about how that works. And I tell people, you kind of trace the money. Like, where did it start? Was it originally separate property? If it was, it continues to be. And that's just the money portion, though. That's not the actual title to the house. So it can get kind of complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yes, these things tend to. And I know a lot of people really struggle with children, which is, to me, the biggest fallout in all of this is the impact on the child or children. How do you counsel people who are going through this to, wow, I can't even say lessen the blow. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? Because their world is getting ripped apart. Your world's getting ripped apart. There's no other way to put it. Their world is getting truly ripped apart. What are some of the best practices in situations like these?
I'm so glad you asked that question. It is really tough, because when you're going through a divorce, like you said, you have your own emotional feelings that are happening. And, if you're angry, if you're, depressed, that stuff goes on to your children. Mm-hmm. I hear people say, oh, my children are tough. Oh, I was a child and everybody said I was tough too, but children believe that they are the center of your world. So mm-hmm. the child thinks, oh, I must have done something to cause this divorce. Yeah. Right. And so I really encourage, you've got to be able to get along for your children. Mm-hmm. And they'll say, oh, he's impossible. He's a narcissist, or she's, borderline personality disorder. She's a narcissist. And
all the label throwing.
Yes. Label. Yeah. Everybody's a narcissist these days.
Yeah. Yes. I know that's the trend.
It is the trend. But I literally have some clients that I kind of counsel, like a counselor would, because I've been in counseling quite a bit. And so I've learned tools that I can teach them. And so, communication with that spouse is so key, especially if the spouse is dealing with someone with a personality disorder. And, I've had clients where I'm like, do not send a text until I see it, mm-hmm. And I teach them how to deal with, the spouse. And I think that my way of doing things can sometimes be different, because sometimes they come to me and they're like, oh, I just want to fight. And I'm like, but that doesn't serve you or your children. You can pay me a lot of money to go into the courtroom and fight. And I will, but you're going to come out not feeling good. You're going to pay me a lot of money and you're still going to feel really bad. But if you kind of take on and listen to some of these things that you can do emotionally to help yourself and help your children, that's going to be a much better outcome for you. Most of the time they take my advice.
Which is good, which is very good. You bring up kind of this ideal scenario of both parents being able to co-parent together, presenting well together, not talking badly. That's one that happens all the time, which is so unfair to the children and puts them in corners. Dad talks bad about mom talks bad about dad. And, these poor kids don't know what to do or think. And, parents are trying to create allegiance at the cost of their children's emotional well-being. But, what do you do, Tina, in a situation where, maybe your soon-to-be ex-spouse or ex-spouse is just still bitter, still belligerent, still attacking, still accusatory, trashing you to the children? I mean, what do you recommend people do in those situations?
You kill them with kindness. And it's hard. It is so hard. And I have clients that, oh, you're not fighting hard enough for me. And I'll be like, I'm telling you, I've been doing this a long time. I went through this myself. I went through it as a child. You're not going to win these arguments mm-hmm. with them, and I'll tell people someday your children, when they're older, they're going to see the truth. And that's going to be what matters. They're going to see how you acted. And you're teaching them as a parent how to respond, right? So if you're responding in kind to your ex-spouse, you're teaching your children. to respond that way.
Right.
And, I have one particular client I'm thinking of, and she was young and just, a fireball, and didn't listen to anything I said, and really got herself into trouble. Mm-hmm. And I ended up firing her as a client, because if my clients don't listen to me, I think to myself, you need a new lawyer, because you're paying me a lot of money to, not follow my advice. And she ended up getting herself in a lot more trouble. And she came back and begged me to take her case back. And she apologized. She swore on her life she would do everything I said. And she did. I took her back, and it was hard for her, because she's like, well, when he says this or that to my child, what am I supposed to do? And I said, you can't do anything. Just love your daughter, love her, and at the right age, you get them in counseling, unfortunately, because they are so torn, and here's another aspect of that I experienced is, when you're talking bad about that other parent, that affects your child, because that's part of them.
Right.
The fact that my father did all these things, who he was, I had a crisis during counseling of, oh my gosh, am I that person too? I mean, I have his blood running through my veins, and so I don't think parents think about that. Mm-mm. That you're saying bad things about mom or dad, but that's saying bad things about your child.
Yeah. It's, it's so sad when you see it, and it happens more often than not. When I see or hear stories about parents who are able to be respectful, kind, loving, co-parent, accepting of, if one of the parents remarried, of that person's spouse, and I know some people who have made that happen, and I'm like, wow, what a blessing for these children to be so wise and to, put past feelings aside and be able to put children first. I mean, I just think that's such a gift that you can offer them. It's possible. It's just not the likely outcome, which is unfortunate. But, as we close, and you're kind of dealing with people in kind of their darkest hour, there is light at the end of the tunnel. What would you say is the lesson and the takeaway?
The other side is so much brighter. It really is. And when you're in the middle of it, sometimes you can't see the light. You get so close. Some of, my clients, they don't follow the recommendation of, counseling or antidepressants. And so, they're still in a doom and gloom, and it takes a little bit longer for them to get out. But, I try with every one of my clients to make sure that they have a plan, and that they, keep thinking of other plans. Like in my life, I had these plans, and I would, I found myself, I'd make this plan. Well, that didn't work, and even just recently, something has happened, and I've had to pivot, and you learn to, what, that was a dream. I'm going to make new dreams. I'm going to make new traditions. My counselor taught me that, the holidays are really tough for me because I don't have anybody. I have my one sister that's still with me, and, some days we're good and sometimes we're not. We're working on it. But, you learn to love yourself, above all else, because when you love yourself, then you have enough to love your children and love people around you. And I think learning who you are outside of that bad marriage is going to be really shocking. It was for me. It was shocking who I had become, and then now who I am now, right. And I would have never left my ex-husband. I really wouldn't have. I believe in marriage, and, but for him, physically abusing me. But I'm so glad that he left me. And I hope he's happy. I think he is, right. But I am too. And in my life, I think God, it just worked out exactly how it was supposed to. Sure. And I think it will for other people as well.
Yeah, you're right. And just hold on hope and faith in that,
Keep the faith.
which is a tough thing to do as you're going through the process, but it is a must thing to do because it's the only way to move through it.
It really is.
Yeah. If, boy, if somebody is listening and they're just in that space of, either counseling or not sure, or, maybe it's time to make that call to somebody, where should they start?
About divorce,
Yeah.
where should they start?
Yeah.
I always recommend you need a lawyer who's in your county. So if you live in Dallas County, you need to find a lawyer that practices in Dallas County. Mm-hmm. Having a lawyer that's in the county where your case will be is important because they're going to know how the judge rules. And so much of how a judge decides custody and finances is subjective, right? So you need to know who your judges are. That's number one. Number two, you need to investigate your lawyer. You need to Google reviews. You can't believe everything you read, but you need to do your research. If you have a family member or friend who can give you a referral, those are always good. And I always say, if you have the time, interview more than one lawyer. I mean, you just, maybe you hit it off with the first one, but don't make a desperate decision. Mm-hmm. I find that people will do that. And then once you're in with a lawyer, it's hard to change and it costs a lot of money to change. So make sure that your decision with that is solid, that you really trust that lawyer.
Well, wise words indeed. I think you and I both agree and hope and pray for all couples who are, yes, facing challenging times or, are at a critical point. We hope that they can see it through and find that way. Also, though, I encourage any woman who is suffering any type of abuse whatsoever to get out of that situation. Absolutely. And seek help. That's kind of where you draw the line.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah. Well, Tina, thank you for this very poignant, heartfelt, and oftentimes difficult conversation. This is just a hard subject to talk about, but it needs to be discussed. And I'm just a believer in knowledge and awareness, and just talking through sometimes the sticky points, because you don't know until you know. And unless women like this are having these conversations and talking about all the sticky points, you don't know. And you need to be informed so that you can make the best decision for yourself. And so hopefully, as we were saying, if we touched one woman today and got her, yes, thinking and analyzing and moving and, feeling the Spirit lead her, then we've done our job, right?
We have. And knowledge is power.
Yeah, that it is. Okay, Tina Montoya, a family attorney and a journey woman. My goodness, if you want to read a journey and maybe you hear yourself in some of the stories that she has spoken of, her book, You're Going to Do Great Things Someday, by Tina Montoya. It's a fascinating read. My heart was with you throughout this entire book, and just really proud of the woman that you are today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being with me, Tina.
Thanks for having me.
We are going to post links to Tina's book and different platforms where you can find her in the description below, just in case maybe you're needing to hear a little bit more from her or want to reach out to her directly or even order her book, which I encourage you to do. Tell us what you thought about today's episode. Was this helpful for you? Was this did it meet your journey and where you are in your season of life right now? And we certainly hope, like we say, if we touched one person, then we've done what we needed to do. And maybe that was you today. So thank you for being here. As I always encourage, if you listen on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please rate, review, subscribe, and share Over 50 and Flourishing with those that you know and you love. Could be a girlfriend, it could be a sister, a daughter, a mother. Please spread the word about what we're doing here on this platform, and let's loop in as many women who could use encouragement as possible. And also, if you like to watch on YouTube, go ahead, subscribe to the channel. That way you'll be notified every Monday when I release a podcast. And I still do my tried and true tutorials on Thursday. Love to be able to continue to provide that content for you. And speaking of content, we have started a new series here on the podcast, and it's called Dear Dominique. And it's an opportunity for you to write into me to ask a question. We'll also provide that link as well if you would like to reach out to me. But today's email comes from Angie, and boy, it's really topical. It says, Dear Dominique, how did you recover from your divorce? I've been following you for years, and I distinctly remember your post when you choked back the tears to tell us that you and your husband were divorcing. Now I find myself in the same situation after 31 years of marriage. I'm trying to start a new life at 56, but even with prayer and therapy, I'm struggling. I'd love to see how you're embracing your new life despite all the heartbreak. You're an inspiration to me, and I would love to know how you powered through. Thank you. Thank you, Angie. I did exactly what it is that you're doing. A lot of prayer, a lot of time in scripture, going to church, talking to a counselor, and powering through. And it's hard, it's just hard. There are some days that will eat you alive. There are some things that you won't understand, that you won't be able to process. But all I can say, and I really believe Tina spoke to this, it's a journey through, but there is light on the other side. And there's no timetable on when that other side is going to happen. We all have our own unique journey and experiences. All of our ex-partners and spouses are different. Our circumstances are different. How things play out are different. So there's no tried and true formula, but my gut tells me, based on what you've shared with me, you're doing everything that you can to strengthen yourself, empower you to move through. I was also blessed in that I met Holly, my today best friend, while I was going through that season in my life, as was she. And what a wonderful companion to have to journey through that season, to have somebody my age, maybe going through different things, but also similar things, to have somebody to talk to cry with, to laugh with. That was kind of the best therapy of all, to be honest with you. So if you have a friend, or maybe I can encourage you to find people, a network of people who are maybe going through something similar. There is just power in numbers and shared story and shared history. So having that was critical for me. And I think kind of got me over the hump. And I will say as well, I am very, very devoted to my son and to my work, and just pouring the time, effort, energy, and attention in those areas also helped me heal. And taking care of myself, doing things for me, making sure I was getting enough rest, making sure I was going to work out, I was eating well, all of those things will enable you to handle a tough situation better. So I hope this maybe points you in a right direction. Maybe some of these things you're doing yourself, but I feel you and I empathize. It's hard, and you will get through it. I promise you. So thank you, Angie. With Pesty, you can get started for just $35 per treatment with a customized plan based on your location, the kind of bugs that you have, and climate. Boy, doesn't it feel good knowing that your house is going to be bug-free for another season? And it's so easy to do. Less than 10 minutes, you get a starter kit that includes a sprayer, mixing bag, pesticide, gloves, and instructions, and it gets rid of over 100 types of bugs. So now is the time to protect your home from bugs with Pesty. Go to pesty.com/over50 for an extra 10% off your order. That's pestie.com/over50 for an extra 10% off.